All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. We've got the defending champs we're diving into today. If you're enjoying our content, please make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate all the support. But we're going to kick things off with Marcus. Dive into the offensive strengths we can expect from the Gators this upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one strength here is the continuity of the front court coming back and just how dominant they are on the offensive glass. Last year finished fifth in the country in offensive rebound rate. I think it's reasonable to say they could end up being, in the top two in the country this year. I mean, with the same group back, another year of experience, led by, Alex Condon, Ruben Chinyelu. Those two up front are very dominant. And then a guy like Tommy Howe, another nice piece in that he's going to play more like three this year, not like 3-4 spot. 11% offensive rebound rate for him last year, so they'll be very dominant in that area yet again. They'll certainly, I think, win the shot volume battle in pretty much every game that they play. Another area that they should be pretty good is taking care of the basketball. Last year finished 77th in turnover rate. This year they've got now a whole new backcourt, of course, with Elijah Martin, Walter Clayton, and Will Richard all gone. But now Boogie Flan coming over from Arkansas. Last year, 10.5% turnover rate with a 24% usage rate. Xavier Lee, 13.6% turnover rate with an almost 30% usage rate. He's got a career 12.5% turnover rate with a career 28% usage rate. So I think with that backcourt, they should be able to take care of the ball quite well. And both of them as well are very good playmakers. Boogie Flan's going to have the ball in his hands a lot on the perimeter. He had a 30% assist rate last year. And Xavier Lee, I believe, was around 37 or 38% in that area. Behind them, it's a little bit like who's going to be on ball, with like Urban Klapskar coming off the bench, 18% turnover rate for him last year. I think you're going to just see a heavy dose of like Boogie Flan and Lee on the ball. And I think this should be another pretty efficient offense. Obviously, you're losing like Walter Clayton in his shot making. You're losing three guys on the perimeter that all made shots at a really high clip. But you've got guys on the interior that are efficient. You're now bringing in Fland, who was solid last year. He wasn't the most efficient, but I think he's a little bit better than what we saw last year. He battled injury. So I expect a little bit better from him. You've got Xavier Lee, who career 51% effective field goal percentage. So I think this team should be pretty efficient, especially considering how dominant they'll be on the offensive glass and, what they'll look like on the interior. But yeah, that's where I see the strengths of this team, headlined by their offensive rebounding attack.
Cody, anything to add here before diving right into weaknesses?
No, not really. They're obviously going to be great on the offensive glass. They're probably the best one in the country now that, Texas A&M's gone. Obviously, that's over at Maryland now, but it's not as dominant as it was the last couple of years. So Florida's probably the leader on the offensive glass throughout the entire country. And yeah, Xavier Lee and Flan are great on-ball creators. You're going to have an elite creator on the floor at all times. They're a little bit different than what Walter Clayton and Elijah Martin provided. Like you could do a little more stuff off the ball with Clayton, and Clayton wasn't really a true point guard, but now you have two true point guards in your backcourt. And I think you see a heavier dose of pick and roll actions. Obviously, they can relegate some of the, initiation to like Condon and Haug is like more handoff hubs and stuff like that. And you can still run that heavy dose of handoff action like they did with Clayton last season. But yeah, I mean, they're going to be, I'm excited to see how it pans out and how those two guys work off of each other. But at the very least, like when one guy goes to the bench, you still have an elite creator on the floor at all times. But that kind of leads me into my weaknesses. And like, I guess before I get into it, like any of these weaknesses are very, I mean, I am probably a little more concerned than some people are, but overall, I still think at the end of the day, this is going to be an awesome team. I think they're basically guaranteed to be a top 10 team in the nation for most of the season with how dominant they are up front. But it's the off ball shooting for me, and the other issue would be like when Tommy Haug slides up to the four, like who's providing that connection at the three position from an off ball shooting perspective mostly. I mean, there are candidates like you have CJ Ingram, who I guess is probably like the leader in the clubhouse to play those minutes at the three when Haug's not playing there. Then you have Isaiah and AJ Brown who could also play the three. And then you could also play three guards and throw Klavchar on the floor and still have enough size in the front court to maintain your rebounding dominance. But you look at it, it's like Ingram, he doesn't really shoot the ball well. He's never been known as a shooter. He's going to be more of a defensive piece, more of a guy that you can play in transition and attack the rim more consistently. I'm just not high on him as like a connector piece within this offense. Kind of the same thing with Isaiah Brown. I think he's more of a defensive piece. Good athlete, can finish it at the rim, but in a half court setting, I just don't really see where he's bringing the value. And this is where Will Richard was so good as that connector piece, could always knock down a three when he was given an open opportunity. Could do a little bit on the ball as well, but I think that's where he was suited best on the offensive end, was as a wing and corner 3-point shooter. Like realistically, the best fit on the offensive end for me would be AJ Brown. I think he's a guy that, he shot at 38% last season at Ohio, and but I guess it's just like the defensive concerns. Like he's probably the worst defender of those three. Doesn't move his feet particularly well for his size, but I was like, from the tape, I was impressed with his shooting ability. A lot of the tape that I saw, he was knocking down like some no dip threes. So I think that's pretty impressive for a guy. And he also shot at 38%. He can get it off quick. And I think that would be a really useful thing for this offense. And it just doesn't seem like they have a ton of that on the wing. Like Tommy Haug, he's an improved shooter. Don't get me wrong. From his freshman to his sophomore year, just major improvements. Like took way more threes, was way more efficient at the free throw line. But I think overall he's limited to a catch and shoot, like stationary guy who probably needs a little bit of time and space, especially relative to the average wing that you're going to see throughout the country. He's not your prototypical three. Like overall, he's probably better suited to play the four, but if you want to get all three bigs on the floor and really emphasize your rebounding dominance, this makes sense. But I am a little bit concerned with him playing more off the ball on the wing. He was 40th percentile in spot up efficiency last season, and then that's only going to become more frequent when he plays the three. And then if you look at another off-ball shooter who you would think is better on paper, it's Xavier Lee, who really kind of struggled to play off the ball throughout his career at Princeton. He's just looked uncomfortable off the catch throughout his career. I don't have the exact number. I think it was like 25 or 26% off the catch last season. If Land's going to be operating on the ball more, and that you would like for more guys to be able to knock down these catch and shoot opportunities, I just don't really think they have it necessarily, or they don't have it in spades like they did last season.
Marcus, anything you're concerned about from an offensive standpoint?
Nothing really to add. I mean, I think that it's very fair, what Cody brings up, and like he said at the beginning, right? It's like small concerns. This team's going to be, at the top of the SEC and, in the top 10 in the country probably for the entire season. So, that front court's just so good that it'll, keep their floor really high, what they have, and the creation of those two guards, should leave them in a pretty good spot as well to complement that. So.
All right, well, let's talk some defensive strengths then of the Gators, and Marcus, we'll keep it with you and let you dive into that.
Yeah, I mean, last year, for as good as Florida was on the offensive glass, like they were okay on the defensive glass, 135th in defensive rebound rate. But I actually think this is an area where, depending on lineups, I think, where they can be quite a bit better this year. Looking like Tommy Houck is going to play more 3 minutes as we've discussed. And so if he's going to play the three out there with Condon and Chinyelu, that's going to be a pretty good defensive rebounding front court with, Chinyelu at 22% defensive rebound rate, Condon at 19%, Tommy's at, I believe, like 16, 17%. And then a guard even like Xavier Lee, who he's rebounded it very well for his career at Princeton, a career 19% defensive rebound rate guy. I think that this should be an improved defensive rebounding attack. I'd be pretty surprised if they, if they weren't inside the top 100 this year. So, I think they should be much better there. I think their 2-point defense is going to be really good again. Last year, they were 17th in the country in 2-point field goal percentage. Again, this just goes with the theme of this Florida team and their front court having like guys like Condon and Chinyelu and Houck and looking at Condon in particular, right? He's a really, really talented player, on this end of the floor because he has the ability at 6'11" to be more mobile, right? He impacts the game in a lot of ways. 5.5% block rate. He really, the tandem of him and Chinyelu in that front court is quite the threat for teams to score on inside the paint and inside the arc. And then on the perimeter, another strength now, obviously losing Will Richard and Elijah Martin. Elijah Martin was one of the best perimeter defenders in the country last year, but you bring in Boogie Fland, who I think can be a really, really good defender in his own right at 6'2", 3% steal rate last year. I think he's going to be a real strength on this defense in the backcourt, especially with the concerns we have when Cody gets into it, I'm sure, with Xavier Lee as a defender. But Boogie Fland's going to be a real strength of this defense with his ability to control the basketball and make plays, with his athleticism. So I think this defense will be, really, really good again. I think it has the chance to be better, as I mentioned, on the defensive glass.
Cody, anything to add for strengths before diving into weaknesses?
No, not really. It's going to be a really good defense with the guys that they have up front. They have 4 rim protectors on this roster, and they can play 3 of them at the same time. So it's going to be pretty impressive. And then, for the defensive rebound rate stuff, like I will say, 135 doesn't look great on paper, but that was 4th in the SEC actually. So it was actually a pretty good number overall. And then when they're going to play that third big, it should only make it better. So yeah, I would be surprised if they're outside the top 100. But when you look at it from that perspective, like there were 4 teams in this league that finished, actually 6 teams in this league that finished outside the top 200. And it's a league that's very hard to defensive rebound in. Like there's so many good teams. There's so many athletic teams that can get all over the glass. So that actually, I think it looks a little bit worse than it actually is. Then just one other strength that I would add is like, it's a very analytically driven defense that just plays to its strengths. Like they filter opposing offenses into the strength of their defense, which is their rim protection and just their size in general. They do a really nice job of limiting catch and shoot opportunities. As a whole, they force a ton of isolation. They force a ton of one-on-one post-ups. They don't really like to send a second guy down there, and they have a ton of size to be able to contend with post-up oriented offenses. So they're going to be just fine. I think this is a better defense than last year just because of like that third big that they're going to play. Obviously, like Martin and Richard were awesome, but I do think they have a more stable floor with this group. And I'll actually just dive into weaknesses. I actually don't have much. They're not going to force a bunch of turnovers. I think that's more scheme driven. They don't have as many playmakers from a defensive standpoint on this roster this season. Like I wouldn't consider Lee to be an awesome playmaker on the defensive end. I think Fland is a very underrated defender that a lot of people don't talk about, and he can do some nice things here. But, if they're going to play a little bit bigger, I think it's going to take away from their turnover forcing abilities a bit more. I think they're going to play a good amount of drop coverage. So I don't really see them forcing a ton of turnovers this season, and where were they last year? 210th nationally. So I just don't really think it's something they value. They do everything else well, so not a concern for me. And then I would just say like unknown perimeter depth that's more of a concern for me from an offensive standpoint than it is defensively, but I think it's something to note. And it just more comes down to like who is going to play the 3 in those minutes where Haug slides up to the 4, because realistically, Haug's not going to play like a ton of minutes at the 3. I think he plays a good amount, but I don't think it's going to be like he's going to play just 25 minutes at the 3 and that's it. He's going to have to slide up and play the 4 a bit. So you have guys like AJ Brown, I didn't really love as a defender. Like I think Isaiah Brown and Ingram can provide an impact here, but overall, I just think it's a little bit of a worse group with a little bit less depth.
Marcus, you got any weaknesses to add before diving into MVP X Factor?
No, I'll dive right into MVP and X Factor. My MVP, I went with Boogie Fland. I think he's going to have the ball in his hands a lot. I think he's a really good playmaker on both ends of the floor. I think he's going to be their best perimeter defender by quite a bit, and I think he's kind of an underrated defender that we're going to see really shine through this year as the primary guard defender in the backcourt here. On the offensive end, as we mentioned, he takes care of the ball well. He's a great creator, great burst to get downhill and make plays for others. So I think he's going to be, their most important player. For X Factor, I went with Tommy Haug. I think, now he's going to be sliding into a starting role. He's going to start at the 3. And, as Cody said, we'll see like how much he plays the 3 versus the 4. But I think, especially when they're in that like 3 big lineup, like how things look. So, ultimately I went with him. I think he has the potential to be the MVP on this team. I think there are a bunch of guys really that could be the MVP for this team, because I think so many guys provide values in different areas. But I think ultimately I went with Hauk because, he has some versatility to play multiple positions.
Yeah, Cody, did you choose from out of the other guys, or did you share the same thoughts as Marcus?
I had the same 2 guys actually. I really wanted to pick Tommy Haug as my MVP. I just think there needs to be an on-ball creator for this offense, from a perimeter standpoint, and I think that's going to be Boogie Fland. I just think I took him over Xavier Lee just because of his defensive ability as well, for him to play on both sides of the ball, and I'm just a little bit higher on not his playmaking ability, but his ability to score at all 3 levels over Lee. And yeah, just the two-way sense would be the reason why I went with that. And then Haug, I think it was a pretty obvious X factor for me. Like if he's going to slide over or slide down and play the 3, his perimeter game is going to be more emphasized, and I'm going to need to see him knock down shots at a higher clip with more volume. And obviously he's a fantastic player that does a lot of things well. He doesn't need to shoot the ball 40% to have like a major impact. Like he basically impacts every other aspect of winning. I just need to see him knock down some more shots if he's going to play on the perimeter more.
All right, Marcus, what's your ceiling? What's your floor for the Gators?
Ceiling, they win the SEC and like they go back to like the Final Four and maybe and win it all with this front court. Their floor, I'd be surprised if they finished outside the top 3 in the SEC and didn't make at least the second weekend in the NCAA tournament. I think that they're pretty safe just with experience in the front court and just how dominant they are alone. So I think anywhere from 1st to 3rd in the SEC, anything other than that, I'd be pretty surprised.
And do you want to add in a bold prediction?
Come back to me.
All right, Cody, what's your ceiling? What's your floor?
Yeah, my ceiling is they win the SEC championship or the regular season title by multiple games. Like I was looking through their schedule the other day. I think they actually have the easiest schedule or the easiest conference schedule among the SEC competition. It's pretty crazy what they were able to avoid throughout that schedule. So I would be sort of surprised if they fell outside of the top 3 like Marcus mentioned. I had it jotted down as 4th or 5th in the league, but that was before I went through their schedule. So I do think top 3 is pretty safe for them. And for my bold prediction, this was an offense that finished second in adjusted offense per Torvik and 13th defensively. I think that's something that can almost be flipped this season. I have more offensive concerns than I do defensive concerns. I think it's a team that can finish as a top 5 defense in the nation, but I do have some concerns just with like the off-ball shooting, and then when one of those guards goes to the bench, like with ball security there. So I do think they could slide outside of the top 10. I think they're like 15th offensively and easily a top 5 defense.
Marcus, back to you. What's your bold prediction?
I went with a Boogie Flan stat here. I think he can average 15 points and 6 assists here. Averaged 5.1 last year. I think he's going to have the ball in his hands a lot, and he's a really effective playmaker, as we've talked about enough. Kind of surprised. Like Torvik only projects him at 3.5 assists. I think that number is ludicrous. I think it should be, at least at his mark from last year at 5.1. So I'm going to say bold prediction, he averages 6 assists.
All right. That wraps up the defending champs. As always, thank you for listening to the Mainly Hoops podcast.